or you want me to go?
You're the chair.
Sure.
Go for it.
Okay, I'd like to call to order the Brownfield Redevelopment Authority meeting for Thursday, December 6th. It's 7 o'clock. Roll call, please.
Johnston,
Present.
Stahl. Here. Tacey. Piana. Here. Rivera. Canales.
Present.
Tobar.
Here. Okay. With that, move to the approval of the agenda. Have a motion.
Motion to approve.
Support.
Okay. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Next, approval of the minutes. This is the minutes from the September 6th meeting.
Motion to approve the minutes of the September 6th meeting.
I'll second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Motion carries. New business.
Cool. Thank you, Chair. So, as you may have seen when I sent the emails out with the materials here, tonight we're here to talk about the Brownfield plan for the city's parking development, 221 West Troy, affectionately known as the DOT, the development on Troy. So, because obviously I threw a lot of information at the BRA in a more truncated period, so we're gonna kind of go a little slower through some of the materials that are associated with this project. It's a pretty complex deal, probably the most complex undertaking the city's ever done, and so there's a lot of moving parts to it. And what I'm going to start with is just sort of kind of backing up the context of what is the DOT, and what is it all about, and then kind of going into high level on the Brownfield plan, and then we're also going to talk about the other pieces that are moving as part of the incentives mix for this project, just so you get a sense of the context in which the Brownfield plan sits for the project, and to understand why it's coming to you now, and sort of why the timeline is as it is. Please feel free to obviously interject with questions if you have them. We want to make this a dialogue as well. And then I have representatives from the private developer that we're working with, as well as PM Environmental, who will talk about the specifics of the Brownfield plan. So again, high level, the DOT. So for those who are not familiar, I would say first go to parkferndale.com, and you'll find a lot of great information about it there. But essentially, this is the mixed-use parking deck that we're going to be building on the corner of West Troy and Allen, right behind Rosie's in our downtown. It's a 400-space mixed-use project with about 14,000 to 15,000 square feet of retail on the first floor, about 100 spaces underground, and then 5 stories above. And on the top levels of the building, it's engineered for 25,000 square feet of office. And so right now we're working with an initial opening footprint of 20,000 that we want to use to induce elevated office market in the city of Ferndale. So we have a lot of office businesses that are here throughout the city, but one of the things that we're seeing, and I'm certain that Ryan from Versa can speak to this a little better, just from his familiarity with the market, is it's still a little bit spooked on office in general. And the market in Ferndale has not sort of quote unquote proven itself in terms of a hot market for office, but we see the pent up demand for it, and we see a need for increased daytime foot traffic in our downtown. So this project is really aimed at not only solving our parking problem, but also being a little future proofed. So it's not just meeting the needs of today's parking, it's really planned for the future and the growth in the downtown, but also including mixed uses to not only achieve a lot of our master plan goals, but also to create more financial stability for the project itself, because just as a simple parking deck, the only revenue stream that could pay for the debt service on this expenditure would be parking revenues. So one of the big things about this is there's a lot of reasons we went for mixed use. The vision things, which are obviously paramount for the city, but also the raw economics of the deal. So there's a lot of reasons that comes together. And so again, you can kind of see in the narrative there, we're also focused on sustainability as well. So this would be going for a Park Smart certification, which is, I don't know if offshoot is the right word, but it's an offshoot of LEED. If you're familiar with LEED environmental design for buildings, they don't certify parking decks. So Park Smart is a certification program that looks at how sustainable it can be from the way it treats waste management, water, and energy usage. So that's kind of how we're looking at it. We're tracking to meet those goals, to meet that certification. So that's essentially what the DOT is. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the pursuit of incentives. So there's a lot that comes together for this project. And one of the things I want to speak to first is the timing. So our goal is to break ground by January 28th. So we're looking to do that, and in order to do so, we have a bunch of milestones that happen between now and then. And this is sort of the first formal milestone in that process. So in fact, just as sort of a nod to the fluid nature of this project, your document shows a gap of $11.3 million. As bids have come in, as we've looked at different tools, that gap is now $9.5 million. So I'm going to get into the overall picture in just a moment. But in general, what that gap reflects is the public side of things, the city parking deck, the retail shell, and the streetscape. And it also reflects the private side, the office, the residential, and again, the retail shell too. And I'm going to get into some of the cost share on that as well, because there's overlap in elements here. This is really a true public-private partnership that without private development, we would essentially be building a deck with a retail shell on the first floor and parking on the roof. So obviously having a private party helps this thing become transformative. So what you're looking at from the Brownfield side is $5.89 million of that package over 30 years. So elements of the city's financial gap are still fluctuating as final construction bids are received as we get closer to that date. So we're looking at sort of the middle of this month and getting a little closer to Christmas to having that crystal clear understanding and that guaranteed maximum price of what this will be. And so we've made significant progress on that. And to meet this timeline, this approval is put forth because essentially having the locals say that brownfield assistance will happen gives us momentum for the state ask. And so spilling into sort of the larger incentive package picture, I'm going to pull that up very shortly here. So I want to scroll. So these are the tools that we're looking at. So you can see another ask, and we met with the DDA's executive committee tonight to introduce them to the concept of a $1 million contribution to assist. These are elements, achieving the deck and the streetscape and the parking and the mixed use. Those are all in the DDA's TIF plan. So this is an opportunity to partner with the DDA on achieving a lot of the goals in their own stated plans, but also to use the TIF for the reasons it exists, to support these public infrastructure. So having that partnership. We're looking at a lot of state asks in here as well. So the local TIF you'll see, and we'll get into the plan in a moment, you're talking about $3.5 million of local TIF over 30 years. And you're also talking about $2.3 million in state. And so we'll talk about that again more in a second. But another benefit of the state, so we're looking at not only brownfield, but we're looking at a CRP loan, Community Reinvestment Program. And so what that is essentially a low interest loan that the developers can use for eligible expenses for vertical construction. So creating the office, creating the retail shell, and that gives them an interest savings advantage over the private market. So private market, you're looking at 5.5%, 4%. The state of Michigan can go as low as 1%. So over, we calculated this out to 20 years, but it saves them $1.7 million over the project. So that's a critical piece of filling the gap. So cheaper financing. So you can see kind of how that package comes together and how the brownfield is a piece of it. And then this is just sort of a look at how we're kind of splitting that up. If you kind of look to the screen, you can see our gap is relatively small. And one of the reasons for that is the developers are absorbing $1.9 million of costs in the deck that are related to the support of their uses. So things like fire suppression, some of the parking, and other elements of vertical construction, elevators, et cetera, things that we'd be investing in that are really aimed at supporting those private uses. So that's a big contribution on their part, and so that's sort of one of the drivers of their gap, and one of the big drivers of and Ryan will speak to this a little more in a moment, but their willingness to meet the community goals that we've set out and to achieve the vision of the approved PUD, so that design has been approved by the Planning Commission. And so Versa has stepped up as part of a public RFP process to find a developer partner to essentially partner with us in meeting those goals. And that makes this project a little more complicated. This is a city that knows what it wants and wants to achieve those things. So we've structured the economics of this project to meet those goals. And so one of those other ones is actually, and I was remiss in pointing out earlier, affordable rent rates for office and commercial. So things that are below market rate, new construction right now, we're seeing numbers as high as $35 a square foot. Our businesses in the downtown are still paying south of 20, and they're just getting introduced now these days to triple net leases. So the idea of absorbing utilities and other costs is a relatively new phenomenon for our businesses. So market rate is a fatal shock to a retail community that's not used to those prices. So what we're doing, what we've built into this area, so as to head off the gentrification of our our retail market as well. We've built in staggered rents to allow this to stair-step toward market and to allow small businesses to compete for this space instead of just having it go to chains like a lot of new developments do. So the focus here is on making this accessible to small business. And we've actually had several downtown businesses approach us about space in here as they grow. So that's an early sign to us that it's working, and we're really committed to sticking to that goal. And that's sort of what, a lot of that is what creates some of this gap. So you can see how the gap is kind of split and how the TIF is really being directed toward these project goals. And so we'll get into more of how that, the eligible activities, et cetera, is part of the plan. But what I'm going to do is go back to the high-level notes.
May I mention a little?
Of course,
from that?
yeah.
So the Gibbs Planning did a downtown retail study. How long ago was that now? 2015. And in it, they said that the city, if it didn't figure out how to figure out its retail, we would have a irreversible entertainment district in 5 years. And we're approaching that 5-year mark in 20 months?
Yeah.
And so between the city and the DDA trying to figure out a retail strategy in the rapidly changing retail market, and honestly, the staggered retail rents is something that Jefferson East taught me in my job and applying it here, and Jordan and his team figured it out for the Ferndale market. So applying cross-border type of learning here, because we do need to still keep our entrepreneurial spirit, which is why we still have a program with the Build Institute. We're the first city to ever partner with the Build Institute, among other things. So this is just one way that we're trying to address that problem.
Thank you for that. That is a really important point. I mean, we're really trying to keep our eye on the ball with that. And so that's sort of your high-level vision. And again, if you have questions on that, you can come back to me and we kind of have that dialogue. But I'm going to shift now to the eligibility and the high-level highlights of the plan. So this has been a true team effort in terms of looking at putting an incentive package together with multiple stakeholders. So we've had a lot of conversations with the MEDC, the Michigan Economic Development Corp., and the MDEQ, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, to make sure, guiding whether or not this thing is eligible and through what pathway, how this money works, how these process approvals work. And so what you're seeing in sort of the timeline of this project is, with local approval of Brownfield, all of our gaze will now start fixing to the state of Michigan and working through their approval processes. And they have been really great in working with us on aligning their process with our need to break ground. This project's been, this pie's been in the oven for a long time, and we don't want it to burn. We want to get it out and have everybody have a taste of it. So we're very focused on breaking ground in late January. And so the MEDC heard that, they responded to that, and normally their process takes about 6 months. So what they've done is they've agreed to split apart the process because we're asking for two things, Brownfield and CRP. They're going to consider Brownfield separately, and they have committed to us that as long as we give them the documents they need, they will put this through the process and get us on the MSF board meeting in February. So that is a huge deal for anybody who's worked with the MEDC on a Brownfield before. That is, they're probably not going to want to advertise that too much because that is a really, really big concession on their process. So we're very grateful to them for that, and it really kind of makes that RRC certification we have shine a little bit. So we're really excited to kind of move through this process. And so in spinning back to eligibility, we are eligible through what's called a blight determination. So my department took a look at this site, took a look at the Act 381 law, and we also took a look at some aerials from 1949. And we found some very large residential and what appear to be either some sort of storage or farmer's market type structures that we believe the foundations are still underground. We believe when you dig into that hole, you're going to find some substantial subsurface debris, which that is a very intentionally used phrase because it happens to be in Act 381 as a qualifier for blight determination. So our department, with the building official, has determined that this is a blighted property, not only for that, but also for several zoning nonconformities that we believe are anathema to the future direction of our downtown. This includes unscreened parking, lack of bike facilities, lack of stormwater detention, and several other items that I've enumerated in the correspondence attached to the document. So knowing that it's brownfield eligible, and what's interesting about that approach is the state of Michigan defers to the local unit of government. If we say it's blight, it's blight. And it would have to be a really extreme assertion for us to be challenged on that. So we have received assurance from the state of Michigan that our determination is accepted and that this is brownfield eligible. And so here we are today. And so we're confident that the project will be financially feasible with brownfield TIF based on the projections that you'll learn a little bit more about tonight, well, a lot more. And we believe that the project could not proceed as designed without it. So that's kind of why we're here. And so key highlights, and I like to try to put this together for every brownfield that we do. This is a 30-year brownfield. And so those familiar with our incentives policy, I'm going to take a pause right now and note that it's 10 years beyond what our policy recommends. Now, the policy does exist as a guideline, and to go beyond that threshold, you have to be of a transformative nature. So the incentives committee met on November 20th and looked at this plan and agreed that it should come before the BRA. So they felt it met the spirit of the policy, it checked all the boxes, it met all the goals, and that's why it's before you today. So I did want to just point that out. And so you're looking at just shy of $5.6 million over that 30 years. And what we're looking at also, another exception that we made to the policy, we started this with the Robertson Brothers projects to have a local pass-through of 5 to 10% on every project so that the local jurisdictions were going to get something on day one. We don't have that in this agreement because our argument here is that TIF dollar, that instead of the way we have structured this, the way we submit it, is essentially we are getting a pass-through, but that pass-through is going to reimburse activities to make this project, this public infrastructure project, financially viable. And so in addition to that, however, the BRA might like this item, $323,863 in administrative fees to the BRA over 30 years. So we did keep the 5% administration fee in because there are auditing expenses, there's plan tracking, there's all kinds of meetings and compliance to keep this thing moving, as well as working with the finance department to track the capture, issue reimbursements, and make sure all of that is on the up and up. So if you kind of look at that spread, you can see it's a little bit repetitive, but you can kind of see a little bit more of the split. So the revenue total for the plan, again, just shy of $5.9 million, and the split there is approximately 3.5 of that is from us locally. So obviously tonight we're just approving, we're approving the plan and really the local, and then this would then go to the MEDC for approval on the state piece. And we're proposing, the way we're splitting up the reimbursement, we're proposing that $1.1 million of that TIF from the local side would go towards city expenses. We have a lot of other tools that the developer doesn't have to reimburse our costs. In addition, they're taking on costs from the deck that we would otherwise incur. So in kind of looking at the partnership and netting out a balance to make both parties whole, we're willing to take less TIF because we have other tools, and we're putting the rest of the local contribution as well as all the state to the developer for their eligible activities. And Ryan will be able to speak to that from Versus perspective in terms of how that's going to support this project. So that's the split that we're proposing. And then what you would be looking at is an annual post-plan tax revenue from this project of about $150,000 a year. And if you look at the 30-year spread of that, it starts at about 102 and it ends at about 148,675. And so that's where I got that number. That's the last year in the plan. We projected 1% growth per year. Working with Cheryl in the finance department, we try to keep those very conservative, both on the up or down side. And so that seems to have played out over the last several brownfields that used it. So we believe it's a reliable peg. And that's essentially what you're looking at a high level. And again, just that public and private split, just some of the rationale behind that. We recognize and facilitate an ongoing investment partnership between the DDA, the City of Ferndale and the Ferndale DDA. So one thing I mentioned earlier as part of that package, we're going to be asking the DDA for a $1 million cash contribution, which they're in the process of vetting through their board members and considering. In addition, we're asking them to enter into an interlocal agreement so that we can collect the TIF on this project and delegate to the BRA. Yes?
Through the chair, so the TIF that'll be collected on this, will it be all of the TIF, or will the TIF be shared with the DDA?
So it'll be all of the TIF.
Okay.
But in order to secure that, we have to have them sign this interlocal.
Okay, but it won't be, it is just, all of it goes to the BRA.
That's correct,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Yes, great question, though, great question. So essentially, one of the things that we recognize here, I mean, with a 30-year journey, that's a long time, even though it's for a good cause, et cetera. So we're going to be building into the reimbursement agreement several things to make sure that this partnership continues. So some built-in check-ins where while we're going to have the developer portion fixed to give them stability, the share that goes to the public, and as we monitor the growth in TIF, both on this property and surrounding properties, we're going to sit down with the DDA at regular intervals. We're thinking about every 5 years, plus when the developer portion has been paid off, to look at that TIF and make judgment calls. As long as certain conditions are being met, like we're making the bond payment, the revenues are coming in, the project's performing, if there's additional revenues to give away, we want the DDA to have a say in that. So we want to try to have folks share into that as is available. So we're building that into the agreement. Additionally, and I somewhat alluded to this, but giving the developer some predictability. So their portion will be fixed, and it'll make sure that they can count on that as gap fill. Because again, they're absorbing $1.9 million in costs that we would otherwise incur. So we're trying to honor that side of the partnership as well. And so I threw a lot of attachments at you. You saw the justification for the blight determination, those fun, grainy old photos from the 40s, as well as the letter from our building official. With that, I definitely want to take any questions. I mean, we're recommending, obviously, tonight that the BRA approve this plan, as well as, according to the filing findings, and we can go into those in a moment. But there's a lot of legal boilerplate here as part of these conditions, but also acknowledging the fact that the city and the developer would enter into a reimbursement agreement that would be reviewed by the city attorney and the city council and approved by both. So that's the recommendation tonight. I do want to, if anybody has any questions over that high-level overview, what I'd like to do is invite the development team to kind of come up and give some of the details behind each of their components first, and then obviously you can do the same as you did with me, interject them with questions. But to start that process off, I'd like to let you meet the developers that we've partnered with. We're in the midst of an exclusive negotiating rights agreement, and this is part of our due diligence phase, putting these incentives in place. So Ryan Schultz with Versico is going to introduce himself and the company.
Good evening, board members. My name is obviously Ryan Schultz with Versa Real Estate. I am the Vice President of Development. I've been with the company for probably about 10 years now, since its basic formation. We are located in the city directly north of us here in Royal Oak. Primarily our focus has been in Michigan, quite frankly, over the last 10 years. We do own properties throughout the United States, but we've always had kind of a need to play close to the heart and invest in the cities that we do work in every day. Some notable projects we've been involved in the past that are kind of coming online right now are the Hyatt Hotel, the Trailhead Apartment Building in Royal Oak. That was another project that involved some TIF financing through the DDA, similar in nature to this project. And speaking more specifically to the DOT project as a whole and how we kind of ended up in this process, there's our joint venture partner, Jeffrey Denha, who's a local business owner here, was approached to evaluate the project and see if it was something he would be interested in. And given his financial backing and then our real estate experience, it seemed like a marriage of two great parties. So we came together, we reviewed the PUD plan, we reviewed the program, and we felt that it was something that we could certainly get on board with 99%. Where many of the other developers that I think were initially solicited wanted to change the program of study. And that's obviously something that Ferndale did not want to do. This is an office project on top of a parking structure, and the office is going to be a catalyst for this community that doesn't currently have that office demand. We do own some office buildings in Royal Oak. We're constantly being barraged by brokers looking for office opportunity that simply doesn't exist there right now. That market is filled to the brim. There's no buildings left. So the next logical place for them to look would be a community that is starting to kick off or become a catalyst for office is Ferndale. It's a logical choice. We've already pushed some of the tenants that we've been talking with saying, hey, this project is coming online. You should look at this. A lot of the same things that would be beneficial in our community of Royal Oak, Ferndale has right here. It just doesn't have that established office market. We can talk some of the financials, or do you want to bring up Elizabeth? Or I don't know how deep we want to get on some of this.
I think just this high-level overview is good.
Yeah.
If folks in the BRA have questions,
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, okay. So I'll touch on some of the points that Jordan brought up too, with the way we evaluate a project and our investment and how we solicit some of our investors in our project and what we have to do, because obviously we're a for-profit company. So the gap that was discussed here is very typical of what we would see if we developed a new ground-up project. If we have something come straight out of the ground, our rental rates, just based on construction costs, tenant fit-outs, things of that nature, are going to put us in that $35, $40 range. It's just a fact of pretty simple economics. That is very tough to muster in a community that's been used to paying sub-$20 rents, both for office and for retail. So based on that, we kind of work the numbers in a little bit different fashion. Us being obviously a for-profit business, we have to give a return on our internal capital. So we come up with that number, which is a fairly typical non-aggressive number. We back into that $22 range, $20 range, and then the gap basically presents itself. And then you have to figure out how to fill that gap. And that gap is being filled with a number of different incentive tools, not just BRA, but BRA is a huge component of that. And that basically gets us to the point where we can say, we can make that logical transition. We can give a number that can keep the entrepreneurial spirit here and not end up with a bunch of corporate tenants, because those are the only people that can afford those rental rates. So we can kind of make that logical transition in that step and continue to build the market and slowly creep up on the rents at a more appropriate scale, and not just hit them with $35 rents and then have a building that potentially may have no tenants. So that's kind of the story as a whole, and certainly as the way we see it. Elizabeth, you want to come up and do your share? Or
Through the chair. Joe or Jordan, can you talk a little bit about council's approach initially with the 40,000 square foot office and what happened?
Yeah, for context, the actual initial PUD that was approved by council and the planning commission called for 40,000 square feet of office. We, upon approval, we immediately released a request for qualifications to the developer community. This would have been about October 2017. And we went through a series of those RFQ processes, and we consistently got interest from developers, but only for residential and not for office. And the consistent reason for that is they didn't see a comp market down here, and they had real concerns about developing any office on spec. And the city council had a decision to make whether to pivot. We had a real offer to consider whether to pivot and adjust the PUD to accommodate more residential and detract from the office ask, or whether we would do an adjustment on the PUD, which we did, and recast the new PUD out to the development community and see if there was any interest. So what we essentially learned was 40,000 square feet was a big ask, and it spooked the market. And we also learned that the market wouldn't build office on spec in Ferndale. So we adjusted the PUD, and we shrank the office ask to 20,000 square feet with potential room for growth, depending on negotiation. And we got actual answers immediately on that. So there was a big size discrepancy in terms of what we were asking. So there was a learning curve from the original PUD, but we learned, we applied that lesson, and we got interest. And then we went out competitively for that. We reviewed bids and then interviewed Versa and Jeff Denha LLC. Wanda, 965 Wanda LLC is how he's going. And it's been a successful relationship since then. We engaged in NRA officially, and that was approved by council in, I think, September, the first week of September. Now, I can call Elizabeth up, right? Yeah. No, batting next.
Evening. So I essentially just wanted to make a couple of points and a little bit more specifics on what Jordan had already introduced. In terms of the way the Brownfield plan is structured, it's understood that the way you are developing your parking structure is that it could ultimately one day house 40,000 square feet of office, and that is still a moving target, and Versa's component of the project is still in flux. So the way we've at least outlined the Brownfield plan today, in order to get this component of the project moving and still be in line with the MEDC's requirements, is to not necessarily speak on that cap to the $5.89 million quite just yet. There's up to $24 million in eligible activities on the site, with the understanding that the $5.89 million is based on 20,000 square foot of office and makes some assumptions of some of the apartment units being potentially affordable, at which point there would be a pilot and no tax capture on those. So a lot of those pieces that are dictating that projection are in flux. So the understanding is that, separate from the brownfield plan that's in front of you today, that the limitations and the negotiations to be made with the developer would be tailored out in a reimbursement agreement. Additionally, the brownfield plan, as it sits right now, has the city of Ferndale as the applicant, with the understanding that the agreement of where that TIF stream goes is something to be assigned out or also determined in that development agreement. The CRP ask itself would likely be coming into the MEDC early to spring of next year, and that would be a separate request made from Versa specifically. They understand the split in applicants on the two components of it and have an eligibility to work out with that component.
Question through the chair. So how many residential units? Is there a number to that?
They're not being built with this.
So initially, the PUD approved up to 24.
Okay.
And Ryan, if you want to add some details to this,
So initially, you have the parcel that defined what would be the residential component. And there were some projections made that the possibility you'd end up with about 24 units.
Okay.
Through some of our conceptual studies, we're actually somewhere down around 13, 12-ish. We are certainly looking at an affordable housing component, so that might shrink slightly. We might be able to get a few more units, but in all reality, I don't think you're going to see anything north of 18, just from the physical size and the amount of infrastructure that has to go in. Stair shafts, elevator shafts, things of that nature, which kind of eat away at that floor plate. So we're definitely sub 20 units.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So I open up for questions? Or?
oh yeah,
Okay.
absolutely, yeah.
Well, I'd like to open it up for questions if you want to. I can start. So I guess following, it helps me percentage-wise. So how does this thing break down percentage-wise? So office, retail, housing. I mean, I guess, maybe it's the first phase, and obviously we don't know where this.
So in terms
What's
of
the
like
goal?
the share of square footage to the project or phasing? Sorry.
Square footage to the project.
So you're looking at the deck being the largest footprint, obviously. So 400 spaces there. You'd be looking at 20,000 square feet of office and about 15,000 square feet of retail. So almost equal. So a little bit more on the office. So maybe like a 55-45, if you will. And then the residential, now this plan and the pro forma to date, like, because there's still some tweaking to the residential, you're still kind of really looking at just the office and the retail. But the residential, again, if you're looking at like 13 units, that would be, Ryan, do you know the square footage of that? Joe? There you go.
I asked for this a couple weeks ago. The architect responded, the parking garage total square footage is 152,646 feet. Office space, the net square footage minus common space is 26,265, although that's been adjusted since.
That was with the former tenant.
That was with a former Target tenant.
Sorry, 19,800.
That's right, 19,800 is the square footage of office space. The total area of the project for parking and office is 178,911 square feet. Office is about 14.6% and deck is 85.4%.
Okay, so then are there targets? So you mentioned the affordability component for retail and for residential potential. I'm just curious what that, is there a target? Is it 20%? Is it, or it's still to be determined based on numbers?
Still to be determined.
Okay.
Obviously, we have some parameters within your ordinance that we have to try to meet, and that's certainly something that we want to achieve. But everything is really in flux with the residential component. Originally, it was included in the brownfield, and we thought that, so the adage, it's the tail wagging the dog. Well, it's
Right.
kind of like really the hair on the end of the tail wagging the dog when you really look at the context of all this. So for us, we felt it was effective to just pull that out of the brownfield component completely. because the duration of the time to figure out the residential is going to be much shorter than the overall project, and the market can do a number of different things in
Right.
that time, and we don't want to bring something to market that might not be appropriate. And there's a number of financing situations we're going to have to go through, and from a HUD standpoint, if we go down the affordable road too. So it just made sense for us to pull that out.
So having said that, I imagine like the grid that's being developed, the structural grid can accommodate and can be flexible for those uses.
Absolutely.
And obviously, office space could convert to another use that we can't foresee in the future, potentially. Or will you build for office, you build for office, you build for residential, you build for residential.
Yeah, the office component as part of the PUD has to remain office. The PUD clearly outlined what can happen at certain portions of the
Well,
project.
as you built it, but like 50 years down the road,
Oh.
physically, it's adaptable based on how you physically design it. And
Yes, it certainly is. It certainly is. And that was also part of the process. We looked at, initially, it's a poured-in-place cash structure. We thought maybe we would just do steel on top of it for the office, and quite frankly, it just makes sense to continue with the same trades and go up. So the office shell will be constructed out of concrete as well.
Okay. So, and this brings, so the type of office space, the class of it, is that still to be determined, or what the market would bear? Are you, is there a target for that as well?
It's Class A. It'll be Class A
Class
office
A,
space,
okay.
brand new construction, yes. Yes.
I just have two more. So as it relates to the brownfield, how would you, just locally, this is considered, obviously it's considered on the high end, and what's the next, I'm just trying to put that in perspective, everything that Ferndale's Brownfield Board's put together and what we've approved.
In terms of the scale, the assistance?
Scale, correct.
What do you think about that? I think this would be, let me double check, I want to make sure. I think this would be the largest brownfield, in terms of TIF, right? Because it's 30 years now. Like Iron Ridge is larger, but it's also shared between Pleasant Ridge and Ferndale. And that's also Oakland County BRA. I believe this is the most TIF that a project's getting. Because for comparison, the folks across from Credit Union 1, they're getting about 2.3. And I believe Ferndale House is getting about $2.1 million. And they're also investing, and I'm remiss in not including the pro forma. In full transparency, and Ryan can speak to those numbers as well. Ferndale House is putting in about, I want to say, $15 million into their project, and 40999 Apartments about 14.1. Ryan, do you want to speak a little bit, just vary at a high level, the pro forma, the high level numbers?
Yeah, like our construction costs?
Yes.
Yeah. So when the residential project was included in this, we were looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 17 million as a private investment. With the residential component pulled out, we're at somewhere trending about the 10.5 million, with some pretty conservative projections. Given the trend in construction prices now, that number may continue to rise, or it may kind of plateau. So, but right now, that's where the private investment in the public project is going to be at about the 10.1 to $11 million mark.
Okay. Okay, the numbers on the cost estimate, it looks it's close to 4 million, I assume site prep, and it mentions soils conditions. Can you talk to, it sounds like it's a challenge site, obviously, and I don't know if you could talk to that, is it soils, just.
I can speak to that briefly. So a large component of that cost is, it's my understanding that the city has multiple bids on the geotech, but the most conservative contemplating foundations that go down to 80 feet to address fill considerations and whether or not they'd have to be structured on bedrock. So it's understood that it sounds like there's more than likely lesser bids to come in that dictate that, but for purposes of the plan have used the conservative estimate received to date.
Is the deck partial underground, or is it all above?
One level more.
Okay. And then timing, this is phased, will the deck be accessible during construction of the lid, or is there plans for that? I'm just curious how logistics and site.
So essentially what we're looking at, we'd be looking at about 12 months conservatively. So I would say don't bet your house on it, but 12, we're thinking about 12 months in, maybe the lower level is made available. but you're looking at about 15 months for construction. And depending on how some of these bids come in, and like Elizabeth alluded to the geotech, if it's found that we don't have to go 80 feet, that shaves time and cost off the project. But right now, we're looking at about 15 months total from shovel to ribbon cutting, and maybe 12 months having, 100, and there's about 100 spaces on the lower level, so you could argue that almost within a year, you almost have the current Troy lot back. That's, we're not putting banners out there on that, but that would be a bonus if it occurred.
And what is the percentage public to private parking?
So it'll all be part of the public parking system, and permit opportunities will be available for the tenants of the office, and in the residential gets built, they'll have access to the city permit program. But it'll be all part of the public parking system that we'll own.
Yeah, and through the chair, and we need the revenue to pay off the $20 million municipal bond.
Indeed.
Build the deck.
That's kind of, okay.
Yeah,
Yep,
so.
got it.
And how many spaces are gonna be reserved for the city to keep public, and how many are gonna, I guess,
Speak to that.
be
Yeah,
allowed?
actually, we're working with our TIF attorneys on that. So the IRS is very picky about public bond dollars and use of permitted spaces. So we're working to comply with a permit structure that would make us eligible for all tax exempt bonds, which is what we want. It's a better interest rate. So right now, structuring it under the IRS code, there would be no committed permitted spaces. And those, technically, we would open it up to the general public. You would assign a permit value, and then anybody could be eligible for that permit if they wanted to pay for that permit in that deck.
That's interesting.
Shoring that up with our attorneys, but trying to get out of that 6% interest rate.
Earlier you guys talked about a staggered rent program to kind of ease some of the people in. I know a lot of Ferndale residents say things like, don't rail oak my Ferndale. What, can you explain that policy a little bit more, and
Sure.
how we're gonna, I guess, ease some of the people that have been there for a long time that don't want to get kicked out?
Absolutely, and I'll invite Ryan to keep me honest if I misspeak on numbers, same with Joe. But in general, what we're looking at, so we mentioned that new construction, and that's something that we picked up on not only by talking to our businesses, but learning from all these different developers that we talked to about what they wanted to charge for the retail, the first floor. So it was a lot of market research. It wasn't as valuable as what Amazon did, but we definitely got a good education on what that market would charge. So what we tried to do is we looked at what our businesses are paying. So they're paying south of 20, and now they're starting to see, as their leases are turning over, these long-term leases, now they're starting to see triple net. So when you look at that, that brings you about, what, 22, 24?
Yeah, you can look at, like, a traditional net would be your taxes, CAM charges, and some of those other elements that contribute to above your base rent as being somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 on top of your base rent. So you could, $22 base rent, another $4 to $5, you're $27, $29 range, which is certainly much different than a $17 gross lease.
Right, and so what we're trying to do is, we're not gonna be able to match that $17 lease, but we're gonna come close to that. So it'll feel more like an inflationary increase as opposed to a fatal shock that only a credit tenant can make. So, a lot of it, another dynamic that you're seeing is, the reason that restaurants proliferate is because once you have that liquor license, the economics, you can start paying those rates. And so Melanie talked about the entertainment district, and while we don't want to necessarily stigmatize or turn away business, we also are having a very keen eye to the fact that Modern Natural Baby can't get a liquor license. So creating opportunities for retail to stay viable and to compete. So with this new space that a credit tenant could come in and, if we weren't Ferndale, we could sign Best Buy and they could come in and do the thing. We don't want to do that. So what this is really about is that starting lease when we open up, and when we talk about the pro forma and the economics of the project, the pro forma calls for a rent that is closer to that $22 to $25 space. And that goes for the office as well. So what'll happen, you'll see escalation built into the lease. So after 10 years, after 15 years, you'll be pegged, you'll kind of bring pace with the market. But what you'll do in that space is you'll allow our businesses to grow with that. So whether that's a new business that wants to come to town, or frankly, like I mentioned before, we've been getting folks that have talked to us that are already here in the city. If those leases are starting to turn over and somebody's going to be jacking that rent up, they can come to this space and have something a lot more similar to what they're used to. So it's essentially giving us a runway and additional shelf space to keep small businesses here. And Joe can...
Just close on that. Also, during the RFQ process, consistently, all the developers we spoke to were looking for about $30 to $35 per square foot for the street level retail. And that was consistent through multiples. So that's essentially what the market wanted. This pro forma is looking at anywhere between 18 to 21. That's the goal, if all things work out.
Thanks, Joe. And the incentive package and the TIF split, all of that is reflective of that goal.
As a reflection and historical marker, when I started volunteering on the DDA in 2004, the average rent was between 12 and 15 in downtown Ferndale. It still is if you have a long-term lease. And this is what's happening. I mean, this is happening downtowns everywhere. It's not just us. But in comparison, the average rent rate for the East Jefferson corridor in Jefferson Chalmers with 52% commercial vacancy is 12 to 15.
Any other questions?
Through the chair, has there been public comment received with respect to this development, particularly, I'm looking at the residential south? Have you had any feedback as to what the feeling is regarding this? Yes, exactly.
We went through about a year of public engagement, public feedbacks, and that engagement actually included a residential focus group for the area, a business focus group, and then ultimately a steering committee that partnered with the Planning Commission. So the community around the project, we require them to be involved, and their fingerprints are kind of on the design of the project. And an example of that is the initial ask was to have the residential be as high as the office, and the residents in the area said, no, we want you to step that back. And so that's why you'll notice that the residential parcel B is capped at 55 feet, whereas the office is at 70 feet, which is by right. But they essentially said, we don't want you to go by right, which is one of the reasons why this is a PUD as well.
Will the city own the deck after this? Or is the city own the deck and then private development's at top?
That's right.
Got it.
Unless, Ryan, you want to buy some debt service payments, I mean a debt.
I mean, that makes sense, but I just
That's
didn't, yeah, okay.
We're cool with that.
Yes. Yes.
No further questions? Oh, if there's no further questions, I'd entertain a motion.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the Brownfield plan for the DOT.
I'll second that motion.
If I may, through the chair, just to make sure, I don't know, in terms of the specific conditions, the motion might need to refer to the fact that there are the findings and conditions in the memo. You don't necessarily have to read them off, but just for the sake of the record, I just wanted to point that out, just in case Dan Chris comes and yells at me later, city attorney.
Okay.
I guess the motion shall include the findings 1 through 6 as listed in the agenda presented on December 6, 2018. With the condition that the developer and the city enter into a reimbursement agreement prior to the disbursement of funds to be reviewed by the city attorney and administration and approved by the city council.
Yes.
Thank you.
You approve his adjustments, okay. With that, you want a roll call or specific or, okay.
Whoops, I've got a couple people missing here, so. Stahl?
Yes?
Tacey? Yes. Piana?
Yes.
Rivera? Oops, Canales?
Yes.
Johnson?
Yes.
And Tobar.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, motion carries. Next on agenda, administrative items.
What we'll be doing, since we're getting close to year end as well, the CED department will be working with finance to prepare an annual report for the BRA to kind of give you a status update on all the projects we have. This will make 17 in the city, and we'll have a status update on each project as well as fund balance for the revolving loan fund, which right now we have about $200,000 in, and so you'll get those reports by the first week of January. That's the goal.
Before we adjourn, any general questions? No? The audience? No? Okay, with that, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second that motion. Or I guess I will motion
So
to,
moved.
motion to adjourn the meeting. Or, sorry, close the meeting.
Any seconds? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just turn this off.